Okay, great. Steve Stockman, great to have you with us as part of our series of interviews on the 10 Mile program that we've been working on. Thanks for coming on, Steve. Good to have you.
Yeah, good to be here.
I wanna start just by checking in, Steve, about who are you, because I know you're a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and some people know you as a blogger. I know you're an author of maybe at least a couple of books that I'm aware of. You are a Manchester City fan. You are one of the visionaries and organisers behind the Four Corners Festival. But you're also a Presbyterian minister. And some people might not put all those things together, like a Presbyterian minister who does all these other things. So I'm interested in just a little bit of who are you background wise, a bit of your faith journey, but particularly that ordination bit and how did that happen? So give us a bit of your story.
Yeah, that's a long story in itself. And to be honest, I don't want to be over spiritual about it, but when you ask who I am, I suppose I spend my life trying to work that out. Who has God made me to be, and what are the personality traits, etc., that has led me here. Somebody asked me a while ago, how did I know I was called to be a Presbyterian minister? And I think all the things you've just talked about, I feel called to be. And I think, and most of all, probably, if I bring it right down, I think I've been given certain gifts, which sadly is not to score goals like Sergio Aguero or pass a ball like Kevin De Bruyne, play guitar like The Edge. Sadly for me, it's my primary two teacher said that I talked so much that I would end up a Presbyterian minister, and I didn't believe in God for another 10 years. And in some ways, in the humor of that, there's actually something about who God was making me to be. Frederick Buechner, an American writer, says that your vocation is where your deepest gladness meets the world's deepest need. And I think I've been trying to find out what that is for a long number of years. I don't want to say or belittle the fact I'm a Presbyterian minister, but it doesn't define me. And I think that has helped in the ministry I've had, which I think is very different than the average Presbyterian minister. And I think God had intention with that. I think he probably did have intention that I would be ordained, but that I would be ordained as this rather quirky kind of strange that I am. I find it hard to believe I'm a Presbyterian minister. And there's been some interesting moments with airport police and customs as a result of the fact that I am. So I think that all these things are part of who I am, and communication, whether that's blogging, whether that's writing, whether that's songwriting or poetry or preaching, is probably the one thing I do the best. Therefore, at my stage of career choice, I wanted to be a journalist. I actually went off to university to do journalism and felt when I got there that God was saying, wrong decision, go back. And I came to faith when I was 17. So I came to faith at Damascus Road conversion. I was an atheist. I discovered God. I discovered that God didn't only exist, but he was interested in me. I came to a very clear, passionate commitment to Jesus of Nazareth. That changed everything, but I'm in lower sixth, getting into upper sixth. And therefore, for careers, that was a difficult time. And I think, therefore, I kept going with the journalism. And I think God sent me back to go on for ordination. Now, interestingly, particularly during lockdown, I've become a journalist. People have said, you're so gifted in front of a screen. And I'm going, you see, the journalism thing could have worked. You're doing all this writing for the Telegraph and for different news outlets. And so I'm doing the journalism, but actually I'm doing it in a different way than I would have been had that been my only career. And I think, yes, it would have been great to have commentated on the World Cup final, but not much eternal consequences to, commentating in the World Cup final, whereas my journalism, my writing has all had this world-changing significance because it's tied into who Jesus is. So you get to 23, you find you've got this gift of preaching. you go on for the ministry and you get ordained, and it takes you down a road. But in that road, I've been a youth development officer for the Church in the Republic. I've been a university chaplain for 15 years. It wasn't until I was 49 that God trusted me with a congregation. So it's been an interesting journey. But and I think that's the thing about it. You don't have to go down a road that's written before you and other people. I remember being at an ordination one evening when I was just ordained, and I compromised, Andy. I'd got the V-neck jumper. I'd bought the chinos. I'd got my hair cut. And I remember that night God said to me, "What are you doing? It's you that I made. It's you that I redeemed. And I want you to be you in this context rather than to become who other people were." And that's kind of the story that still goes on. I still discover things about how God has made me now when I'm waiting for a bus pass at the end of the year, believe it or not.
Look, you're looking well, Steve. You're looking well. I want to pick up, I know you said, being a Presbyterian minister doesn't define all of who you are, but you are a Presbyterian minister in Fitzroy, which is a church in South Belfast, as most people will know. And Fitzroy has been linked with Clonard over the years. So Presbyterian Church, South Belfast, a Catholic monastery parish in West Belfast. They don't usually go together. And I know that kind of predated your time in Fitzroy. Tell us a little bit about that relationship, maybe what it did look like and what it looks like now.
Yeah, and I look back to some of that Clonard Fitzroy beginnings, but here's the key thing. There's occasions when Belfast traffic stops because there's an accident on the West Link, and it takes 2 hours to clear, and you could be in traffic for hours. It happened to me one night, and I took this strange route home from the centre of town. It took me 3 hours to get home from the centre of town to South Belfast, and during this trip, about 2 hours in, we're on the Falls Road, and my daughter says, "I need a toilet, Daddy." And I said, "Well, love, it's going to be another hour. I don't just hold in." And then I went, "Here, I need a toilet." Clonard. So we nipped up to Clonard. I walked in, the lady on the desk says, "Steve, how you doing? Are you here for Mass to see Father Kieran?" I says, "No, really, all we need is a toilet." And to have relationships across denominations when you're stuck in traffic is a marvelous thing. And it all started not with me at all. And I think for me, where I came into it was in 2009 when I was called to Fitzroy. I became aware that I would have to get involved in the Clonard Fitzroy Fellowship, and that made me have to think through a lot of my relationships with the Catholic Church, with Catholic friends growing up, with any priests that I knew, and I was very friendly with the chaplain at Queen's at that time, Father Gary Toman, because Ken Newell had set up with Jerry Reynolds this amazing relationship between the two, the church and the monastery back in the early 80s at the height of the Troubles. And if we want to look at those days, I think there's a documentary the BBC did called 14 Days about 1988 and all that happened around St. Patrick's Day of that year. And Father Alec Reid was at the heart of the British soldiers who were killed on the Andersonstown Road, and he was at that IRA funeral to get the kind of conditions that the IRA would go into talks with politicians, and that I think was the start of the process, and that came out of Clonard. At that same time, my congregation, long before I became its minister, had started Bible studies and prayer meetings with Clonard to discover each other, to find out whether all the stereotypes and caricatures that you're told about the other in this society that we're brought up in, are they true, are they not true? Let's build ourselves around scripture and prayer that we had in common. That relationship was very important, not only for Fitzroy, but actually for the wider society. And I think Ken's book, Captured by a Vision, talks a lot about how the church should be and was involved in that whole peace process at that time. So when I came in 2009, I think God had slowly, over 30 years, probably prepared me for that time. And it was a privilege to walk into the spirituality of Clonard. I think, we talk a lot about the differences we have in theology. Father Jerry Reynolds, who passed away sadly a few years ago, he and I had some really great moments about Mary and the Mass, because he wanted so badly to give Janice and I communion, and he couldn't because of church rules. And I was a Protestant. I really was very happy with the blessing from Jerry. The Mass wasn't so central to me, but it really hurt him. And we had these wonderful moments and half hours and hours of just talking about the differences in our faith and the differences, to hold the differences. But for me, Clonard, and then what has happened since that I'm sure we'll come to, the richness of brothers and sisters in the Catholic faith who have dynamic prayer lives and really passionate about Jesus. The richness of their friendship, spiritual friendship with me, has been enormous, and I think that's where we have to get through the technicalities and the differences. Yes, we have theologically, but life is flesh and blood and heart and soul. It's not statutes. It's so for me, Clonard Fitzroy was an enriching thing that I had to take on as I came into Fitzroy, and have been blessed by it.
And Steve, you mentioned your connection there with Father Jerry, and then I want to move that on then to another connection with a Catholic priest that you know and love well, Father Martin McGill, because that kind of, if I understand it right, kicked off what's become this Four Corners Festival. Now, some people may have heard of it or been to it, but essentially it's a festival, annual festival, which is now near 10 years old, I think you were saying to me. But it's about kind of bringing people out of their own corners and visiting other corners of the city. And it's about a whole lot of other things. But tell us about your connection with Father Martin and how the Four Corners kind of kicked off, and a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, it's funny. He's just off the phone with me, and my father-in-law lives with us now, and he said to me, my father-in-law says when he gets off the phone, "Do you converse every day?" and my wife sometimes thinks we do. But I think at this stage, without question, Father Martin and I would see each other as the person we share, anything with. When we have interesting moments in our day, how am I reading that? I'll ring Steve or I'll ring Martin. And it started because Father Martin wanted to do in Lenadoon, actually, and I know he's got history in Polglass as well.
That's right, yeah.
But he was in Lenadoon, and he invited me up to Lenadoon. Now, you're 10 miles from Hollywood to Polglass, 29 or 30 from Harryville, to Lenadoon. It's a lot further psychologically, spiritually, and everything else. And so what happened was that he wanted to do an Irish language class. This was before the Skenos, East Belfast, wonderful stuff that's happening over there. He wanted to do an Irish language class that, being Father Martin, he had all kinds of ambition with it. And one was that Protestants and Catholics would learn the language together and therefore would relate to each other. And he knew that Protestants weren't likely to go to Lenadoon, but he thought they might come to Fitzroy and that Catholics would come to Fitzroy because we have an Irish language service once a month that happens in Fitzroy. And therefore, he knew that that might be a neutral space. So that's how we met, because he asked me for the space. We went and had a coffee to try and work out the logistics of that. And both of us would share that when we come out of having that coffee, we both turned different ways to go home, but both of us went to ourselves without telling the other. I can remember going, what just happened there? We hadn't even arranged to meet again, but I remember saying to God on the way back to Fitzroy, where my car was parked, that's the start of something. I have no idea where that's going, but that's going somewhere. And it was almost that kind of spiritual moment. And so we met a couple more times, and I went up to Lenadoon one day to see him, and going up to Lenadoon from South Belfast, Kennedy Way is okay. You get to the roundabout, you turn left, and it's like an Narnia wardrobe. You drive through into this other world. There's sports stadiums, and there's schools, and there's parks and ice cream parlors, which I took particular note of. And I remember thinking, my children have never seen this part of our city. This is my city, and we've never been. and I was sharing this with Father Martin, and he'd been to the East Belfast Festival, couldn't find Tullycarnet Library or Ballyhackamore Library or somewhere. And we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do something that got people across the corners? And then we'd been talking about, and forgive us for this, but we'd been talking about how dull the week of prayer for Christian unity had become. In fact, he'd said that it was so dull sometimes he wanted to protest for the Free Presbyterians outside. Because it had become, oh, you read at my service and I read at your service, and there was really nothing dynamic happening, and we'd been talking about maybe a fringe to it, doing something. So we came up with this idea of a festival. Now, why we thought that, I have no idea. We rang the late Glenn Jordan, who sadly passed away last year, Gladys Gagnon, Ed Peterson from Clonard, and we had a meeting, and within 3 months we had our first festival. And that's where you try to take people across the city. I think one of our major events doing that was probably taking the New Irish Arts into St. Peter's. I think that night there was about 600 at that event in St. Peter's, and I think I'm right in saying that maybe 75% of those who attended said they'd never been in that building before or in that part of the city. And what we're trying to do is take people across the city that they might then meet people from the other part of the city and form friendships, get into conversation. And of course, in the midst of that, we're trying to do art and poetry and music and discussion and all kinds of other things. And yeah, next year will be our 10th anniversary, which is hard to believe. And it's become a bit of a, and then there's the offshoot of it, because Martin and I are asked to speak at all kinds of different places and write all kinds of different articles, because thankfully the festival seems to have got some traction in the city, and we hope that we're making a contribution to some reconciliation.
Steve, one of the places you got asked to speak, because I know this, was the Sinn Féin Ardash, and that's so the Sinn Féin is like an annual conference, whatever you want to call it, and you and Father Martin get asked to speak at that, which is unusual for a Presbyterian minister, I would imagine. So tell us a little bit about that and just that experience.
Well, the first thing is, do what if you behave yourself, you might not have to do such things, because what happened was a couple or 3 years before we were asked to speak, we were just asked to go. Martin had an invitation to go. It was in the waterfront, and it was early days in our relationship and our friendship, and he rang me up and he said, look, I've been given a couple of tickets to the key speech at the Ardèche on Saturday night. Excuse me, rang Ken Yule, my predecessor in Fitzroy, to ask what he should do. And Ken, being a nice man that he is, said, I think you should go and you should take Steve. And I remember him telling me this, and it took about 2 or 3 days to think, should we go? And in my head was, what will my family think? If the camera pans round and there's Steve Stockman and Father Martin McGill listening to Jerry Adams at the Sinn Féin Ardèche, what are my family going to think? What's the denomination going to think? What will Fitzroy think? And so I said, look, this is too early, Martin, and I didn't go. But the next morning in Fitzroy, I got up and I confessed that was wrong. And I confessed that I'd listened to the fears of those around me and the pressures of those around me to do the Jesus thing. And so there's a verse in the Bible that says, if you confess your sins, you're forgiven. That's great. But the next part says, and God will purify you from all unrighteousness. So 3 years later, I got a phone call on a Sunday afternoon from Declan Kearney, the chair of Sinn Féin. And Declan says, the Ardèche is in Derry. And I'm thinking, I know what's happening. And I've learned I'm going to go. I'll sit and listen to whoever. And then he said, we'd like Father Martin and you to speak. And I'm thinking, if I'd gone the first time, would God had to have purified me? And I wouldn't have had to have purified me, and I would have got away with this. We took a lot of time to think about that. I rang immediately in the next 24 hours after the invitation. I rang 3 friends who'd lost fathers in the Troubles. And I asked them what they would feel if I got up to speak at the Sinn Féin Ardèche. We talked to all kinds of ends of society. And I decided I'm not a politician, I'm a preacher. And if somebody's going to ask me to preach at the Sinn Féin Ardèche, if I can talk about the grace of God at the Sinn Féin Ardèche, I'm not giving that possibility up. But we were careful. And probably it's parts of it maybe too careful. I can remember Janice thinking, what do you wear? And I said, well, anything but orange. And And one of the women on the stage was dressed in orange from top to bottom, so she got to go away with the orange. But we took a lot of time and we took a lot of effort over it, and we felt it was for us the right thing to do. And I think we probably got it right. I started by, now having said that, on the day when we walked into the Millennium Forum in Derry, and I looked around me at all the different kind of exhibitions that were on, and I'm thinking, I can't get up here, because my opening lines were to bring those friends' fathers into the forum to say, tonight we remember people that we lost, and I'm remembering people, and I thought, I can't get up at the Sinn Féin Ardèche and talk about the people that were killed in the Protestant side of that. And I remember saying to Martin, maybe we need to change that first paragraph. And he said, well, at that stage, you've actually sent your speech to the press. They're not allowed to use it until you've said it. That's an embargoed thing. So he says, well, if you don't say it, that's going to be the headline, because they've got it. And if you don't say it, they're going to say, why did you not say it? So it was a challenging night. It was a challenging few months. But for me, if I can share what I think, I believe, Martin and I do a thing at Queen's every year on religion and peacemaking. And many of the people that go do that course are doing it because they've never heard religion as a peacemaking thing. They've always sensed that religion is a divisive thing. And if we can contribute an incredible amount of Christian theology about peacemaking into situations, then even with all the care that we're going to take, we take the opportunity as best we can to share grace and forgiveness and hope and all those things that we believe our society needs coming out of Christian spirituality.
Brilliant. Great story. But one of the things that might have kind of led to, and I'm sure it has, and other things you've done, and it would be maybe a little bit of kickback from your own constituency within the world of Presbyterianism or other Protestant denominations who might think Steve Stockman's gone way too far, and that example of speaking at a thing like that is kind of underlines their point, you know. So what would you say to that in terms of folks with it? How do you deal with criticism or kickback from your own constituency, if you like, because that's something that other people who are listening in might have experienced a little bit? And what's your kind of thoughts around that?
Yeah, and I think I want to come with some empathy and sympathy. It took me, John Brewer has a book about the churches and reconciliation and peace, and Professor John Brewer, John talks about being passive peacemakers and being active peacemakers and the difference between the two. And I would suggest that probably for 25 years of my Christian faith, I was a passive peacemaker. I believed in peacemaking. I believed we should reach out, but I wasn't doing much of it. I wasn't taking any chances. I wasn't getting into positions where I could be criticized by my own congregation or my own denomination. And so I understand the fears that are out there, and I think fear is the biggest obstacle to doing that. And I think, sadly, many colleagues don't do it because they're frightened of getting their photo taken. Well, I've just admitted to it. I was frightened of cameras panning around and seeing me in the wrong place. So I do understand all of that. And I think if I look back on it, Andy, I think God took a long time to prepare me. Clearing my parents' house a few years ago, I discovered a letter that I'd written to the Ballymena Guardian when I was 19 about peacemaking and stepping out across the lines, love your neighbour, etc., etc. And I was young and naive in the faith, and I really believed in this. I came to faith through the Beatles, really. So the Beatles had given me all the questions and were pretty much for my teens. They were the band who'd kind of shaped my mindset, and it was all you need is love, give peace a chance. And when I met Jesus as a 17-year-old, that all dovetailed beautifully, because I think the Beatles had set up the questions that Jesus then answered and given me some sort of a robust strength to be able to do the things that the Beatles had dreamt about doing but didn't have the ability to do. And so I'd written this letter, and then was amazed the next week when another Christian had come back and told me I knew nothing and you really can't love your enemies. And But what it taught me in clearing my mum's house was, that was in the late 70s, and it wasn't until it's not until the late 2010s till I'm in the Sinn Féin Ardèche. So, and I think that the way I describe that is that the Holy Spirit was chipping away all the cultural things that got in my way of being an active peacemaker. And that was fear, it was prejudice for sure, it was stereotypes, it was all kinds of things, fear being the biggest one. And I probably, what God did in that journey, if I look back, is he got me sidelined in Presbyterianism because I played U2 in churches, and that was enough to have letters written about my spirituality. And therefore, by the time I started to do this, I was so black sheep and maverick that nobody was surprised and paid too much real attention. I think for me, though, it's not that I'm getting flack on a daily basis or phone calls or letters or emails. It's the hurt that I felt. Martin and I won the Civic Leader Award from the CRC a few years ago, and the Presbyterian Church, to me, should have been using that as a real peacemaking story. And I don't think anybody even phoned me to congratulate me. And Union College, I don't know whether they're doing classes on reconciliation or not, but I'm speaking next week at a theological college in Vancouver and a university in Indiana about peacemaking in Northern Ireland. And my own denomination doesn't recognize that. I think that's where that's more hurt. I feel more hurt than I do feel. But talking to those I've met a lot of younger ministers who I think, as I speak to them, would like to take the chances I've taken. But the fear of what their congregation would say, what their peers would say, that it would get them not sound anymore. And I lost the soundness a long time ago. I remember saying to a friend, I could do that. I burnt my bridges. And he actually said to me, I wish I'd burnt mine. And so there's a lot of us that are stuck in our peer groups. I would suggest that there may be teenagers watching this, we hope, but I would suggest that the floor of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church is a stronger peer pressure than I went through in my teens. And I'm just glad that I'm out of that cauldron so that I can follow Jesus rather than have to follow church or peers.
Yeah. So, Steve, I'm going to draw this to a close, but I want to tap into some of your wisdom around engaging in Catholic context. So, part of this 10 Mile project has been speaking to youth work organisations who have a heart for connecting with young people on the island of Ireland, not just the north of the island of Ireland. Yeah. And so as soon as you're talking about the island of Ireland, you're talking often about Catholic contexts. And we've been grappling with the whole question of how do you do that well? How do you engage in Catholic contexts, particularly as what might be perceived as Protestant sort of organizations? So I suppose my question is, what have you learned about how to engage well when we're talking about stepping into Catholic contexts?
I'm still learning. I do think that mission, this will get me into trouble, but I think missionally we're trying to make people Protestants, and Jesus never had any intention of making anybody a Protestant. He had an intention of making people disciples and followers. And I mean, I've been the youth development officer for the Presbyterian Church in the Republic, and I remember when I was there, it's a huge country with very few Protestant mission posts to try and convert a whole country to Protestantism. And I remember meeting the YWAM team there, and first of all being shocked because some of that YWAM team were Catholics and had this dynamic evangelical faith that I was told didn't exist. And then they were saying that their dream was to have an evangelical Bible study in every Catholic parish in the Republic. They probably said Ireland. And I remember thinking, and I'm going to go down to some wee Protestant church and do a wee mission in a corner, hoping that I might reach this huge populace. Should I not resource these guys, or if they felt even that they needed the resource, to try and go that way? And I think, when we look at, if we look at Fitzroy and you look across the city from Fitzroy towards Father Martin on St. John's and the Falls, and then beyond that, probably the next Presbyterian church, at least with a minister's, Crumlin. And there's a whole swathe of the city that has no. And so what I think I'd like to think we've tried to do, and I think, to be fair to Father Martin, we did this better when he was in Sacred Heart in the north of the city. I used to go across on a Monday night. He had a Bible study through the Psalms, and so he brought me in to do some of the teaching. And again, Catholics with Bibles around the table. I grew up being told they weren't allowed to read them. So all the caricatures that are broken down once you start to engage in these different kinds of ways, and then finding people like, Jim Deeds or others that we work with, Ed Peterson. I've been to Ed Peterson's home in New Jersey. Ed works out of Clonard, and there is an evangelical. You could land that in the middle of evangelical Ballymena, and nobody would notice the difference. And yet he's Catholic, and we're all Protestant. And so I think I think for me it has been about friendship. And it's interesting because I think the first book that was written about Jerry and Ken was called Friendship Towards Peace. And I think when Martin and I speak at a lot of university groups coming in from America, we would come down to say, you see all that stuff we've talked about peacemaking, it comes down to friendship. To meet somebody and realize who they are rather than what your book about what a Catholic thinks says they are and what a Protestant book says they are, or what your cultural background says they are. It's about meeting people, and it's about relationship, and it's about sharing faith in those ways. And as I said during this, the enrichment in my faith of being friends with people like Jim Deeds and Father Martin McGill are just, and Father Gary Toman, they're just huge because of what they've taught me about how to pray, how to read the Bible, how to share that with other people. And so when you break down those caricatures, suddenly you're into, I think, what Jesus was about, which was making disciples rather than Protestants or Catholics.
Brilliant. Steve, our time's up. Thank you for making yourself available. Thank you for sharing your experience, your story, and your wisdom with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.